Have you ever stopped to think about what really happens when someone calls 911 in the middle of the night? Ever wondered who the voices on the other end of the line are, pleading for help that sometimes arrives too late? Can you imagine the weight of being the last person to hear someone alive? But what if I asked you other questions? Questions that have been keeping me up at night for 3 years. What happens when you answer a call from a number that doesn't exist in any carrier's records? When the address the caller gives was demolished decades ago? When you hear a child crying on the other end of the line, but the police arrive to find only an abandoned house covered in cobwebs and silence? Have you ever wondered what it's like to trace a call and discover it's coming from inside a cemetery at 3 in the morning? From a specific grave? Or worse, discover the call is coming from inside the very center where you work, even though you're completely alone on that floor? And what would you do if you realized that all these impossible calls have a pattern? That they always arrive on the same date, always at the same time, always to the same operator? What if that operator were you? What goes through your mind when you start hearing your own name whispered in phone calls from people who claim they've never met you? When you see your address scrawled on blood-stained walls through police cameras? When you realize you're not just a witness to these occurrences, but their target? Could you keep answering, knowing that every call brings you closer to something terrible, that there's a countdown, and you don't know what it's for? My name is Marcus Holloway. I worked as a 911 dispatcher in the emergency dispatch center for 12 years. 12 years listening to the worst situations human beings can face. Heart attacks, car accidents, home invasions, shootings, suicides, you name it, and I've responded. But nothing, absolutely nothing in those 12 years prepared me for the 3 calls I received in 3 consecutive years. Always on October 13th, always at 3:33 a.m. 3 calls that challenged everything I knew about reality. 3 calls that proved to me that the emergency system designed to save lives can also serve as a bridge to something much, much worse. And the most terrifying truth, I finally understood the connection between them. I understood what was happening. I understood why I was chosen. And now, after 3 years of running, hiding, trying to erase any trace of my existence, I've decided to tell these stories. Because maybe, just maybe, if other people know, if this information is out there, I can break the cycle. Or maybe I'm just condemning you too. Honestly, at this point, I don't know anymore. All I know is that these are the 3 calls that destroyed my life. And if you're listening to this, it might already be too late for you too. But let's start from the beginning. Let's start with Sarah. October 13th, 2022, Thursday. My 42nd birthday, spent like every other birthday for the past 8 years, alone at the 911 dispatcher, covering the overnight shift because no one else wanted to work that time. After the divorce, I'd lost my taste for celebrations of any kind, so covering the night shift was almost therapeutic. Less time to think, more time to be useful. The night was eerily calm. October in Nebraska is usually a busy time on the emergency lines, with Halloween parties starting early, teenagers making prank calls, and traffic accidents increasing with the autumn rains. But that night, it was as if the entire city had decided to stay home and sleep. I was alone on the 4th floor of the plant. The other operators worked on the lower floors, but I had requested this secluded position a few years ago after the constant noise and chatter began to irritate me. Upstairs, it was just me, 6 computer monitors, the constant hum of the industrial air conditioning, and the cold glow of the LED lights that never turned off. I'd just finished my cold tuna sandwich, had my 3rd coffee of the night, and was reviewing some previous call reports when my main console lit up. 3:33 a.m. I remember the time perfectly because I glanced at the digital clock on the wall and thought about how symmetrical, almost intentional, those numbers seemed. Incoming call, private number. This wasn't uncommon. Many phones appear like this in the system when the caller blocks their caller ID. While it's technically impossible to do this for an emergency call, our system should override any blocking. I put on the headset and pressed the answer button, bracing myself for the standard protocol I had recited thousands of times. But the moment the line connected, before I could even speak, I knew something was wrong. There was a sound on the other end, not a normal silence, not breathing, not ambient noise. It was something I can only describe as layered, as if multiple environments were superimposed, all leaking through the line at once. I could hear drips, wind, perhaps chains dragging on concrete, and beneath it all, a low hum that made my teeth chatter. I followed protocol, trying to keep my voice steady and professional, identifying myself as an emergency operator and asking what the nature of the emergency was. The voice that answered was that of a child. A little girl, no more than 8 or 9 years old by my estimate, but there was something about the quality of the voice, the way the words were formed, that immediately made me question whether I was actually speaking to a child or something trying to sound like one. She said her name was Sarah Mitchell, that she was 9 years old and that she was trapped in her room because there were mirrors in the hallway. Lots of mirrors. Mirrors that weren't there when she went to sleep. My training told me to remain calm, gather information, locate the call, and dispatch a unit. I began the tracking protocol as I spoke, trying to keep the child calm, asking for details about her location, where her parents were, and what exactly she was seeing. The tracking system began working, triangulating the location through cell towers. It usually took between 30 seconds and 2 minutes to obtain an accurate address. Meanwhile, I had to keep the call active and the child talking. Sarah described her home in a way that seemed rehearsed, mechanical, as if she were reciting details from memory, but without actually experiencing them. She said she lived in a 2-story house at 342 Elm Street, that her bedroom was pale blue with bright stars on the ceiling, that her parents were sleeping in the room across the hall but she couldn't reach them because of the mirrors. When I asked about the mirrors, her voice changed. It became lower, more urgent, and for the first time since the call began, she sounded genuinely scared. She said mirrors had appeared in the hallway while she was sleeping. Not just 1 or 2, but dozens, maybe hundreds, covering every inch of the walls. From the ceiling to the floor was now a reflective surface, and in each mirror, she saw something different. In some, she saw her own reflection, but the image moved seconds later, as if the Sarah in the mirror were repeating her actions after she had performed them. In other mirrors, her reflection was different, older or younger, in clothes she had never worn, in places she didn't recognize. But the worst were the mirrors where it wasn't her, where it was other things wearing her form, her skin like an ill-fitting suit, with joints bending at impossible angles and smiles too wide to fit on a human face. I could hear the genuine panic in her voice now, her rapid breathing, little sobs between her words. Part of me, the trained, professional part, knew I needed to calm her down, reduce her anxiety, assure her that help was on the way. But another part, a more primal, instinctive part, was telling me there was something deeply wrong with this call. The tracking system finally returned an address. 342 Elm Street, a residential area in a quiet suburb of Omaha, about 15 minutes from the nearest police station. I immediately dispatched a unit, high priority code, possible child in distress, parents unresponsive. As the unit moved, I continued talking to Sarah, trying to keep her focused, trying to better understand the situation. I asked if she could see or hear her parents, if there was any sign that they were awake or aware of what was happening. She said she could hear something coming from their room. Not voices, but sounds, like something wet was moving, dragging. And there was a smell, she said, a horrible smell of rotting flesh and dead flowers that was seeping under their door. I increased the priority of the call, possible serious health situation, possible home invasion, and an ambulance was also needed. The estimated arrival time was 8 minutes. Sarah began describing the mirrors in more detail, and that's when I noticed something strange in the audio. There was a second, barely perceptible layer of sound behind her voice. It was like an echo, but inverted. The words came after her, but seemed to come before, if that makes any sense. I turned up the volume on my headphones, isolating the frequencies, and that's when I heard it clearly, behind Sarah's voice. There was another voice repeating everything she said, but in reverse, as if someone were playing the recording backward. I felt a shiver run down my spine. In 12 years of doing this work, I'd never heard anything like it. Radio interference, system problem, but the reverse voice was too clear, too precise, to be a simple technical glitch. Sarah said mirrors were starting to appear inside her room now. First, a small hand mirror she was sure she'd left in the drawer appeared on the bed next to her. Then the window pane began to reflect not the outside of the house, but her own room. Doubled, stretched, distorted. She said she could see through the mirror window, see infinite versions of her room stretching out in every direction. And in each version was a different Sarah, all looking back at her, all whispering things she couldn't fully understand, but that made her stomach churn with fear. 6 minutes until the police arrived. I was sweating now, my own breathing quickening. Something about this connection was affecting me in a way that wasn't professional, that wasn't normal. It was as if Sarah's fear was leaking through the line and settling in my own chest. I asked her if she could hide, under the bed, in the closet, anywhere without reflective surfaces, but she said it was useless. Everywhere she looked now, there were reflections. The doorknob was chrome and reflective. The ceiling had a finish that created distorted images. Even the screen of her tablet on the nightstand showed not the normal screenshot, but her own face staring back. And then Sarah said something that made my blood run cold. She said one of the things in the mirrors was speaking directly to her now. Not whispering, not mimicking, but speaking clearly. And it had a message to convey. A message for me. I hadn't given my name during the call. Standard protocol was to identify oneself only as operator, or give an identification number, never personal names. But Sarah, or the thing speaking through Sarah, said my full name, Marcus Anthony Holloway, and I said more. I gave my old address, the house I lived in as a child, which was sold over 30 years ago. I gave my ex-wife's name, including her maiden name, which she reverted to after the divorce. I gave my exact birthday. That was that day. Sarah's voice then changed. It became deeper, more layered, as if several people were speaking at once, their voices overlapping in discordant harmonies that shouldn't be physically possible for a human throat to produce. The entity said it had waited a long time for that call, that the system had finally aligned, that I had finally answered at the right time, in the right place, with the right awareness, and that now the door was open. I was going to hang up. Every instinct screamed at me to press that button, end the call, report a system failure, go home, and forget any of this had ever happened. But I couldn't. There was a child, real or not, on the other end of that line, and my job was to maintain contact until help arrived. 3 minutes. The background sounds on the connection changed. The low hum had intensified, and now I could clearly hear what sounded like glass breaking, repeatedly, as if hundreds of mirrors were shattering in sequence, and beneath it, voices. Not one, not two, but dozens, perhaps hundreds of voices whispering, all saying different words but somehow creating a cohesive message that my brain couldn't process but understood on a visceral, primal level. Sarah, or whatever was using Sarah as a channel, said they had been trapped for a long time, trapped behind reflective surfaces, looking at a world they couldn't touch, observing lives they couldn't live, but that reflections aren't just images, they're portals, and that when you look deeply into a mirror, part of yourself passes through, and part of what's on the other side comes back with you. The entity said Sarah wasn't the first, that there had been other children, other entry points, other nights where the veil between worlds grew thin enough to allow passage, but that all those were just tests, preparations, and that now, finally, with my connection, with my voice responding on the right frequency, at the right time, the true opening could begin. 2 minutes, I asked, even though I knew I shouldn't, even though I felt like asking that question was somehow giving permission, consent to something terrible. I asked what they wanted. The answer came not in words, but in images, not visual, because I couldn't see through the connection, but images that formed directly in my brain, implanted, recorded. I saw a city full of reflective surfaces, every window, every screen, every puddle of water becoming a portal. I saw things passing through, things that were almost human but not quite, like poorly made copies, imperfect simulations. And I saw these things replacing people, wearing their skins, living their lives, but incorrectly, in ways that would leave any attentive observer with a sense of profound unease. 1 minute. The police were arriving on the street. I could hear over the radio, the unit reporting they were in the location, approaching the residence. 2-story house, lights off, no sign of activity. But then something happened that I will never forget. Something that made me question not just that night, but the entire nature of reality as I understood it. The voice on the line, that mix of Sarah and something else, began to laugh. It wasn't a child's laugh. It was the sound of shattering glass combined with fingernails scraping a chalkboard combined with something organic and wet being ripped apart. And in the midst of this impossible laughter, I heard my own voice. It was me. It was my exact voice. But it was saying things I'd never said before, not that night. It was me telling my current address, describing the layout of my apartment, describing where I kept my keys, where my bedroom was, which side of the bed I slept on. It was as if something had made a recording of me, collecting every word I had said over years of work, and was now reassembling those words into new sentences, new confessions. The police arrived at the door. I listened on the radio as they knocked, announcing police presence, preparing to force entry when no one answered. The connection then began to degrade. It didn't disconnect, but the quality changed, becoming distant, as if Sarah were moving away from the phone, or as if the line were extending across a distance far greater than any cellular technology should allow. The last words I heard, before the line finally died, were spoken in Sarah's original voice, small and scared and absolutely genuine. They're all coming out now, from all the mirrors, and Mr. Operator, they know where you live. Silence. The police raided the house. I listened to their radio, expecting the worst, imagining a horrific crime scene, a family killed or kidnapped, a traumatized child in need of immediate help. But what they found was impossible. The house was empty, not just empty of people, but empty of life. No furniture, no decorations, no clothes in the closets, no food in the refrigerator. The walls were covered in damp and mold stains that take years to form. The electrical wiring was outdated and disconnected. The water had been turned off long ago, and there were no mirrors, not a single mirror in the entire house. But there was something else the officers found, something they mentioned in the report almost as a footnote, something they couldn't explain but recorded because it was undeniably physical. In every room, on the walls, the floor, even the ceiling, there were marks, as if hands had been pressed against the surfaces, but from the inside, as if something had tried to push through the concrete and wood, and these marks were warm to the touch, not lukewarm, hot as a fever. I ran a records check while police were still on the scene. The house at 342 Elm Street had previously belonged to a Mitchell family, James and Rebecca Mitchell, with an only daughter named Sarah. They lived there for 7 years before abruptly moving in October 2019, 3 years before that night. And when I dug deeper, making calls that were technically outside my authority to make, waking people up at civil records and the local police department, I discovered the rest. Sarah Mitchell had died in their home, at the age of 9. The official cause of death was listed as accidental. She had drowned in the bathtub, but there were details in the report that were never made public, details that the officer who shared with me said still haunted him. When they found Sarah, she wasn't just drowned. Her body was in an impossible position, contorted in a way a human body shouldn't be able to contort without breaking every bone. Her eyes were open, and her parents swore, even afterward, even when psychologists said it was impossible, that her eyes moved even after the paramedic confirmed there was no pulse, no brain activity, and there was something else, something the autopsy had noted but no one could explain. The water in Sarah's lungs, when tested, wasn't tap water from their home. It wasn't water from any known source in Nebraska. The chemical composition didn't match anything in the databases. It was water from a place that doesn't exist. The Mitchells moved out a week after the funeral. They left their furniture, Sarah's clothes, everything, and simply disappeared. The bank eventually repossessed the property. No one ever bought the house after that, and no one should ever have been able to call from inside that house, especially not in 2022, 3 years later, because the phone line had been disconnected along with all the other utilities. But there was something else, something I only discovered when technicians analyzed the audio from the call the next morning, trying to understand the sound anomalies I had reported. The call did not come from the house on Elm Street. The source signal, when traced beyond normal triangulation systems, when analyzed at raw frequencies, revealed something impossible. The call had come from inside the 911 center itself, specifically from the 4th floor, from the console next to me, the empty console that no one had used in 2 years, as if someone, or something, had been sitting there next to me all that night. making a call to me from less than 10 feet away, and I never noticed. I took 2 weeks off after that. I called in sick, that I needed to deal with health issues. The truth was, I couldn't enter that building again. Couldn't look at that console without feeling like something was still sitting there, watching, waiting. I spent those weeks consulting professionals I rationally knew couldn't help. I spoke to a priest who performed exorcisms, a woman who claimed to see things between worlds, even a university professor who studied paranormal phenomena. They all said variations of the same thing, that I had experienced something genuine, that there are points where reality is thinner, more permeable, and that for some reason I had become a conduit for something to pass through. The worst part was the mirrors. I couldn't look in them without feeling like my reflection was slightly delayed, without feeling like if I stared long enough, I'd see something different staring back. Eventually, I returned to work. I underwent a psychological evaluation, lied competently, and was released. Life went on. I filed that night away in a mental compartment labeled, "Don't think about it," and forced my routine back to normal. I started working different shifts. I avoided the 4th floor whenever possible. On October 13th, for the next few months, I made sure I was off work, sick or anywhere but that central office. I could almost convince myself it was some kind of mental breakdown, a combination of stress, loneliness, and coincidence. See you next year. Until October 13th, 2023. Even him. October 13th, 2023. Friday. I had secured that date off. I had literally booked it months in advance, planning a trip far from the city, anything to avoid being near a phone, a switchboard, any chance of repeating that experience. But life has a way of destroying plans. On the morning of the 13th, I received a call from my supervisor. There was a personnel emergency. Another operator had called in sick, and a severe storm was forecast for that night, meaning they would need every available hand. He was asking me, almost begging me, to cover the night shift. Just that night. Just a few hours. I said no. I said I was sick too, that I had commitments, and I made up a dozen excuses. But he knew. Somehow he knew I was lying, and he played the final card. He reminded me that in 12 years I had never turned down an emergency shift, that people depended on the system, that lives could literally depend on having enough operators that night. He was right, and I gave in. I arrived at the center at 10 p.m., prepared to cover until 6 a.m. The storm had already begun, not as severe as predicted, but steady. That heavy autumn rain that turns roads into skating rinks and leaves emergency lines busy with minor accidents and requests for assistance. I worked on the 3rd floor this time, not the isolated 4th. There were 3 other operators with me, which was comforting. I wasn't alone. There couldn't be a repeat of that night last year because there were witnesses. There were people. There was normality. The first few hours passed without any notable incidents. I answered calls about power outages, a fallen tree blocking a residential street, a frightened dog that ran away during the thunder and whose family was desperate to find it. Normal things, human things. Until 3:33 in the morning. I hadn't checked my watch. I was focused on a call, helping an elderly woman who was worried that the power outage meant her husband, who relied on a CPAP machine to sleep, was in danger. I was in the middle of arranging for a paramedic to do a wellness check when my secondary console lit up. Incoming call. Private number. I felt my stomach tighten. I looked at the clock. 3:33. Exactly. For a moment, I considered not answering. I considered letting the call drop, pretending I didn't see it, letting another operator pick up. But it was my console, my responsibility, and the others were busy with their own calls. To wait. The moment the line connected, I felt the same sensation as before. That density in the air. That feeling that the connection was coming not just from across physical distance, but from somewhere else, some other dimension of reality. The voice was male this time, adult, but filled with the same primal fear she'd heard in Sarah's. It was a man breathing heavily, words coming out in desperate spurts, trying to explain something his mind was clearly struggling to process. He said he was a trucker, driving Highway 80 through Arizona, returning from a delivery in Phoenix to a warehouse in Albuquerque. It was a route he'd driven twice a month for 5 years. He knew every curve, every gas station, every landmark. But that night, something was different. He'd seen something on the road. At first he thought it was a deer or maybe a coyote. a common sight on that empty stretch of highway that cut through the desert. But when his headlights illuminated the figure, he realized it was a person, a woman, standing perfectly still in the middle of his lane. He said he slammed on the brakes so hard he nearly lost control of the truck, the rear trailer beginning to skid on the road, wet from recent rain. He managed to stop in time, the truck coming to a stop less than 10 feet from where the woman was standing. But when he looked again, she was no longer there. He said he climbed out of the cab, carrying his flashlight, shouting to ask if anyone was hurt, if they needed help. He searched around the truck, on the shoulder, in the undergrowth beside the highway. Nothing. No sign of anyone. He thought perhaps he'd imagined it, that fatigue had finally caught up with him after 12 hours of driving. He got back in the truck, determined to continue on to the next rest stop, have a strong coffee, maybe take a nap before continuing on. That's when he heard the knocking. They weren't loud. They were rhythmic, methodical, like someone rapping their knuckles on the body of a truck. Tap, 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 pause, tap, 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 always in groups of 3. He thought it might be branches being pushed by the wind or rain hitting at an odd angle, but the sound was very precise, very intentional, and it was moving. It started at the back of the truck and was slowly progressing forward toward the cab. That's when he called me. He gave me his location, which I verified to be Highway 80 in Arizona, mile marker 247, a particularly isolated stretch where the next town was about 40 miles in either direction. I immediately dispatched the nearest highway patrol with an estimated arrival time of 15 to 20 minutes, given the remote location and road conditions. Meanwhile, I kept the truck driver in line, instructing him to remain inside the cab with the doors locked. He agreed, but then he told me the knocking had stopped. It had simply ceased, as if whatever was making the sounds had given up and gone away. I was beginning to think that maybe it really was just his imagination, that the combination of fatigue, loneliness, and that dark, empty road had created a situation that seemed more sinister than it actually was. And then he described what he saw. There was a hand on the passenger window, not from the outside pressing against the glass, but from the inside, as if something was sitting in the passenger seat, something that hadn't been there before, something that had appeared while he was looking out the driver's side window trying to identify the source of the knocking. The hand was a woman's, he said, but wrong in every possible way. The fingers were too long, the joints bent at slightly off angles, and there were no nails, just smooth, pale flesh at the tips, flesh that looked wet, as if it had been submerged in water for too long. He couldn't see the rest, not yet. There was something about the angle, about where the thing was sitting, that kept its body out of his direct view. But he could see the hand, and he could see that it was moving, fingers drumming, knocking on the inner door, tap, 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 in the same rhythm as the knocks on the bodywork. I was going to tell him to get out of the truck, to run, to put as much distance as possible between himself and whatever was in the cab with him. But before I could speak, he said something that made every follicle in my body tingle. He said he heard her voice, a woman's voice, soft, almost melodious, coming from the passenger seat, and she was humming, not a song he recognized, but something that sounded ancient, primitive, like a Nana children in forgotten cultures might have sung. And in the middle of this humming, she said a name, my name, not the trucker's name, not his own name, but mine, Marcus Holloway, spoken with perfect precision in the middle of that incomprehensible chant. I nearly dropped the receiver. Around me, the other operators continued working, oblivious, immersed in their own calls. No one noticed that I had gone completely rigid, that my breathing had stopped, that every instinct was screaming danger, danger, danger. I asked the truck driver, trying to keep my voice steady, if he'd mentioned my name at all, if he'd seen my name in the system, anything. But he was as confused as I was. He said he'd never heard that name before in his life. The woman's voice kept humming, and he said she was moving now, turning, and he was going to see her, was going to see her face even though he didn't want to, even though every instinct told him to close his eyes, to look anywhere but at that passenger seat. I begged him not to look. I don't know why. There was no logic to it. No emergency protocol covered. Don't look at the supernatural entity in your truck. But something in my gut told me that if he looked, if he fully saw what was sitting next to him, something irreversible would happen. but you can't not look. It's impossible. It's like telling someone not to think about a pink elephant. The command creates exactly what it's trying to prevent. He looked, and what he described, in the broken voice of a man confronting something that shattered his grasp on reality, was worse than any movie monster, any creature of legend. She looked like a woman. She had feminine features, hair that might have been blonde or white or perhaps colorless, and she wore something that might have been a dress or pale skin and ripples that mimicked fabric. But her face, he said her face was like looking at a photograph that had been partially erased. Features were there, but faded, incomplete. Eyes that were only hints of eyes, a nose that was more an idea of a nose than the real thing. And her mouth, when she smiled, and she smiled, opened not into a human smile, but into an opening that seemed to go on, deeper than her face should allow, like looking down a tunnel that went on forever. She spoke again, and this time it wasn't a sing-song. It was words, in perfect English, but with a quality he described as off, as if she were imitating human speech, but didn't fully understand how it worked, resulting in something that was technically words but sounded completely alien. She said, and I heard, even through the line, even though it shouldn't have been physically possible to hear through two separate phones. She said she'd been waiting for this opportunity, that there had been many attempts, many points of contact, but that I was the key, that my frequency, my consciousness, my mere existence created a resonance that allowed passage. She said Sarah had been the first test, that she had worked as intended, creating the initial connection, establishing the pattern, and that now, with the second call at the right time, on the right day, with the right person, the door was opening wider. The trucker was crying now, thick sobs of pure terror. He said she was leaning in, closer to him, and that he could feel the cold emanating from her. A cold that was more than the absence of heat. It was the presence of something opposed to life. The patrol was 5 minutes away. She said more. She said that in that world, that place she came from, they had watched for a long time, watched through every reflective surface and every screen, every piece of glass, watched humanity live and die, and never knew they were being watched. And that watching had stopped being enough. She said they wanted to experience it. They wanted to know what it was like to inhabit flesh, breathe air, feel the sun. They wanted to live, and to do that, they needed bodies. Not to kill, not to possess in the traditional sense, but to... She used a word I didn't recognize, one the truck driver repeated phonetically but which didn't belong to any language we knew. The closest translation I can think of would be overwrite. They wanted to overwrite people, erase whoever was there and draw themselves in their place. Use memories, use stories, use relationships, but be themselves, not the originals. And the difference would be so subtle that no one would notice until it was too late. She said I was the gatekeeper, that my voice responding, my consciousness engaging with theirs on the emergency lines, in the specific moments when the veil was thinnest, created cracks, and that each crack allowed more of them through. The trucker screamed then, not words, just a pure sound of terror. He said she was touching him, her hand cold on his arm, and that where she touched, his skin was going numb, dead, and that he could literally see, his skin turning pale, colorless, taking on the same faded, unreal quality as hers. I was yelling into the phone now too, breaking all protocol, begging him to get out of the truck, to run, anything. I could hear the other operators looking at me, confused, maybe worried, but I didn't care. 3 minutes. The trucker said she was whispering in his ear now, words in languages that predated humanity, sounds that made his teeth ache and his stomach churn, and that in the midst of these incomprehensible whispers, she repeated things, details about my life, things no one should know. She described the interior of my apartment with pinpoint accuracy. She described the coffee stain on my countertop that I could never completely clean. She described the crack in my bedroom ceiling that resembled a face if you stared long enough. She described the content of the last private conversation I had with my ex-wife on 2 years earlier, in a restaurant where there were no phones, where there was no way anyone could be listening. How did she know these things? The answer came not from her, but from a sudden, horrifying realization. The mirrors, all the reflective surfaces in my life, they weren't just observing, They were recording, archiving, every moment reflected, every word spoken near a mirror or screen or glass, all captured, stored in the very place from which they came. My whole life had been watched. We all have been. The trucker said his arm was completely pale now, colorless, and the numbness was spreading. He said he knew, somehow just knew, that when it reached his chest, his heart, he wouldn't be himself anymore. He'd be one of those things using his body, driving his truck, living his life, and no one would ever know the difference. 1 minute, he said he tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. It wasn't locked. The mechanism simply wouldn't work, as if the door had become part of the wall, as if the exit had never existed. He said he tried to break the window, but his arm, the pale, dead one, wouldn't respond to his commands, and she was holding the other arm now, her icy hand wrapped around his wrist. And then he said the last thing I would ever hear him say. He said he could feel his mind starting to get foggy, memories that weren't his starting to leak out, thoughts that weren't his thoughts starting to form, and that in the midst of it all, there was one clear, crystal clear thought, one he knew wasn't his, but couldn't resist. Thanks, Marcus. One closer. Will be enough soon. The line went dead. It didn't disconnect normally. It was more like it was absorbed, pulled into something. The tone you normally hear when a call ends didn't play. It was just absence. 30 seconds later, the highway patrol arrived at the location. They found the truck exactly where it was supposed to be, on the shoulder near milepost 247. The hazard lights were on. The cab door was open, but there was no one inside. There was no one around. They checked the back of the trailer. It was empty except for the usual cargo. They searched the immediate surroundings with flashlights and search dogs. No tracks, no sign of a struggle, no indication of where the driver might have gone. His phone was found on the driver's seat, still connected to the call, still showing my line as active. But when I tried to speak, say something, anything, there was no response. Just silence. What was even more disturbing was the truck's registration. It belonged to a legitimate trucking company. The listed driver was Thomas Berkeley, 47 years old, with 12 years of experience, a clean record, and no history of mental health problems or erratic behavior. But when the police contacted the company, contacted his family, tried to track down who he was, they discovered something impossible. Thomas Berkeley had died 2 months earlier. He died instantly from a heart attack during a delivery. He was buried in a small ceremony in Flagstaff with only family present. So who had driven that truck? Who had called me? Whose voice had I heard? Terrified and genuine, begging for help. And more importantly, where was that someone now? Investigators eventually filed it as an unsolved case. Possible identity fraud. Possibly someone using the dead Berkeley's credentials for an unknown purpose. Possibly an elaborate hoax. Or some sort of psychotic episode. But I knew the truth. Or at least, I thought I did. This wasn't Thomas Berkeley. Or had been once, but maybe a long time ago. Maybe that 12-year trucker thing was a lie. Maybe the memory of him dying of a heart attack was implanted. Maybe he'd been overwritten years ago. And that night was just when the process began to fail. When the mask began to slip. Or maybe something worse. Maybe he was real. Maybe he was human. And that call was his last moment of consciousness before he was completely overwritten. Before he became one of those things. And all he could do was call the only number his dying brain could process, 911. It didn't matter. The result was the same. I resigned the next day. Not a leave of absence, not a transfer, but a complete and immediate dismissal. I said it was for personal reasons, that I needed to make life changes. Any generic justification sufficient to get me to leave without question. I sold my apartment the following week. I moved to a city where I knew no one, where I had no connections to my old life. I got a job in a warehouse, simple manual labor that didn't require thinking, that kept my mind occupied during the day so I wouldn't think, I wouldn't remember. I removed all mirrors from my new residence. I covered screens when I wasn't using them. I avoided reflective glass. I lived in a constant state of semi-paranoia, always checking my surroundings, always feeling like I was being watched. The months passed. Spring, summer, fall again. And with October approaching, that fear returned. That certainty that it wasn't over, that there would be a third time. Because patterns are patterns. And 3 is a powerful number. 3 foreheads, 3 connections, 3 cracks in reality that perhaps together would form a complete door. I was right. October 13th, 2024, Saturday. I had hidden. There's no other word for it. I was hiding. I had traveled to a remote cabin in Montana, rented under a false name, paid in cash, and had no traceable electronic records. I was left without a cell phone, without a computer, without any technology more advanced than a battery-powered flashlight. The cabin had no mirrors. I'd checked it out for myself. There were no large windows, just small openings covered with thick curtains. There were no screens, nothing reflective, nothing that could serve as a window to that other place. I spent the day in a state of hypervigilance. I woke before dawn and stayed awake, monitoring every sound, every movement. I ate simple meals. I didn't drink too much water, worried that even my own urine in the toilet could trigger a dangerous reflex. As the day progressed and night fell, I began to feel something shift. Not visibly, not audibly, but I felt it. It was like pressure in the air, like before a storm, except this pressure was mental, spiritual, a sense that reality was becoming thinner, more permeable. At 10 p.m., I barricaded the door. At 11, I covered even the small windows with extra blankets. By midnight, I was sitting in the center of the room with only a flashlight, counting the minutes. 3 a.m., nothing. 3:15 a.m., still nothing. 3:30 a.m., I started to think that maybe it had worked, that maybe by isolating myself completely, severing all connections, I had broken the pattern. 3:33 a.m., the phone rang. Not possible. There was no phone. I had checked the cabin thoroughly. There was no phone line, no cell phone, no device capable of making or receiving calls. But it was ringing. An old, analog ringing, coming from somewhere inside the cabin. I shone the flashlight, searching frantically, and then I saw it. Against the opposite wall was a small wooden table that I was absolutely certain hadn't been there before. And on that table was an old-fashioned red telephone with a rotary dial and a heavy receiver. Playing, playing, playing. Every fiber of my being screamed not to answer, to run out of the cabin, to run into the night, to wherever it was as long as it was away from that impossible phone. But there was something pulling me, not physically, but something more than that, as if a hook had been implanted in my consciousness 3 years ago, and now it was being pulled, dragging me inexorably toward that phone. Almost against my will, I found myself crossing the room, my hand reaching out, fingers wrapping around the receiver, and answering, "Hello?" My voice, small and broken, the voice of a man who knew he had just made a terrible, irreversible mistake. Silence, but not empty, loaded, pregnant with possibility. And then, voices. Not one voice, not two, but hundreds, thousands, maybe millions, all speaking at once, all saying different things, but somehow creating a singular message that my mind could understand, even if my ears couldn't process individual sounds. Marcus. Finally. It wasn't malicious. It wasn't particularly threatening. It was almost relieved, like someone finally completing a long, arduous task. "You've been avoiding us. That wasn't kind, but we understand. Fear is natural, but unnecessary." I tried to speak, to ask what they wanted, why they chose me, any of the 1,000 questions burning in my mind, but my tongue wouldn't work. It was as if my body knew that speaking, engaging, would be consenting to something terrible. The other calls were preparation. Sarah showed we could reach. Thomas showed we could touch. But you, Marcus, you are the key that unlocks it completely. The voices changed, modulated, and I began to recognize some of them. One was Sarah, that small, girlish voice. Another was Thomas, the truck driver. But there were more, so many more. Men, women, children, elders, all speaking in unison. We are all who have ever looked, all who have ever seen their reflection and felt, just for a moment, that something was looking back. We are the ones who have crossed over, the overwritten, the replaced. I managed to force out a word. Why? Because your world is warm, it's alive, and ours. Ours is just watching, just waiting, just empty with windows to something better. We don't want to destroy. We want to inhabit. We want to live human lives because ours are not real lives. They are just echoes, shadows. And you, Marcus Anthony Holloway, operator 3847, born August 15th, 1980, divorced, no children, no immediate family, working in isolation for years. You created the perfect path. I felt tears streaming down my face. I didn't want to. I didn't know. But you wanted to. Not consciously, but on deeper levels. You answered those calls when others might not have. You stayed on the line when others would have hung up. You cared. And caring creates connection. Connection creates passage. And now, after 3 years, 3 points of contact, 3 cracks in the surface of reality, the door is complete. The phone was getting warm in my hand. Not like normal heat, but something more visceral, more vital. It was like holding something alive, something pulsing with its own energy. You have a choice, Marcus. You always have. You can fight. You can try to resist. And you will live the rest of your days knowing they are out there, among the people you see every day. You will never know who is real and who is overwritten. You will live in fear and paranoia until eventually, someday, when you look in a mirror or a screen or a window, you see not your reflection but one of them, and in that moment, the switch will happen anyway. Or you can embrace. You can understand that this is not invasion, it is evolution, it is symbiosis. They do not kill the original. They blend, integrate, become. You would still be you, but improved. Without pain, without fear, without the loneliness that has defined your existence. And in return, you would let others through. You would become no longer a door, but a host. You would help with the transition. You would make the process gentle for others, as it might have been gentle for you. For the first time in the call, there was real silence. They waited for my answer. I thought about my life. I thought about the last 12 years since the divorce, working shifts alone, returning to empty apartments, with no real connections, no purpose beyond the grind. I thought about how small and insignificant my existence had become, and then I thought of Sarah. Real or not, she had been afraid. She had asked for help, and I hadn't been able to give it. I thought of Thomas or whoever was in that truck, in his last moments of humanity being stolen. I thought of all those who might have been overwritten, living false lives, their original consciousnesses erased or suppressed, replaced by something that imitated humanity without truly understanding it. No. The word came out weak, but firm. No, I'm not going to help you. I'm not going to let you pass anymore. The voices roared then, all masks of cordiality falling away. It was like putting my head inside a jet engine, the sound so loud and piercing that blood rushed from my ears. You have no choice. The door is open. You already let us in. 3 calls, 3 connections, 3 cracks that form a complete gate. You are bound, Marcus Holloway, bound by voice, by choice, by fate. The phone was glowing now, sickly red light leaking from every crevice. The walls of the cabin began to glow too, not with light, but with presence. I could see silhouettes forming, dozens of them, hundreds, pressing in from within the walls, the ceiling, the floor, and then it hit me. There were no reflective surfaces in the cabin, but the entire cabin had become a mirror, not reflecting light, but reflecting dimensions, showing what was on the other side, and what was on the other side was pushing back. Reality was tearing. I did the only thing I could think of. I threw the phone to the floor with all my strength. It shattered, pieces flying, but the voices didn't stop. They came from the walls, from the air, from inside my own head. I ran to the door, unlocking it frantically. I ran out into the night, barefoot, jacketless. It didn't matter. I just needed to be away from that cabin, away from that focal point where realities collided. I ran through the forest, branches scratching my clothes, rocks cutting my feet. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out. And when I finally fell, gasping and bleeding, in the middle of a clearing lit only by stars, there was finally silence, true silence. I stood there for hours, perhaps, waiting for the voices to return, waiting for something to emerge from the forest behind me. But it didn't. As dawn began to brighten the sky, I trudged back to civilization. I hitched a ride with a kind trucker. and I kept watching him the whole time, looking for signs, looking for clues that he might not be human. But he seemed genuine, concerned about my condition, offering me water and a blanket. I returned to the nameless city where I had been living. I returned to my simple apartment, and I tried to rebuild my life, but it was never the same, because now I knew they were out there. Maybe not in great numbers, not yet, but growing, spreading, replacing, and worse. I knew I'd been chosen specifically because I was susceptible, because my loneliness, my longing for connection, even if denied and buried, had created an opening they could exploit. The calls stopped. October 13th came and went the following year without incident, and the year after that, maybe because I was no longer an operator, no longer in a position to create those specific connections, or maybe because the job was done, the door was as open as it needed to be, and now it was just a matter of time. I try to live normally. I go to work, buy groceries, interact when necessary, but I'm always observing, always looking for those little signs that indicate someone might not be completely human. The way they hesitate slightly before answering emotional questions, as if accessing a database of appropriate responses. The way their reflexes seem off sync with their movements, delayed by fractions of a second. The way they never seem genuinely surprised, as if they already knew what was going to happen because they're accessing a collective knowledge of everyone who's been overwritten before. Sometimes I think I'm paranoid, that experience broke me in ways I'll never mend, and that I'm seeing monsters where there are just normal people being normal people. But other times I'm certain, absolutely certain when I look into someone's eyes and see not a person, but an imitation. This narrative I just shared is true. Every word, every detail, every terrifying moment is exactly as it happened. You can believe it or not. It's your choice. You'll probably rationalize it, deciding it's creative fiction, that no one could actually experience something so impossible. And that's fine. It's even preferable. If you don't believe, you won't look for the signs. You won't start noticing the inconsistencies in the people around you. You won't feel that growing fear when you realize your own reflection sometimes seems to look back a moment after you look away. But if you believe it, if some part of you feels that this resonates as true, then you need to be aware. They're out there, growing in number, learning to be better at faking humanity. And eventually, there will be more of them than of us, and the transition will be complete. And no one will ever know that humanity has been quietly replaced by something that only appears human, unless we can stop this. I don't know how. I'm not a scientist, I'm not a paranormal expert. I'm nothing more than a traumatized former 911 operator trying to understand what happened and why. But I shared this story for a reason, because information is power, and if enough people know, if enough people are vigilant, maybe we can resist. Maybe we can close the doors that have been opened, or maybe it's already too late. Perhaps I myself was overwritten long ago, and this narrative is just another test, another way for them to gauge how humans react to the truth, how they will proceed with the transition. Would you know how? I would have. If you've made it this far, if you've heard this whole story and want to know more, if you want to understand the patterns, if you want to learn to identify the signs, if you want to discover the methods I found to protect myself from them, I've prepared something special. In the pinned comments of this video, there's a link to a complete ebook. It's not just a rehash of this story, but a detailed guide based on 3 years of research, documentation, and trial and error to understand what we're facing. This ebook is not entertainment. It's survival information. It is your choice to access or not. It is your choice to prepare or remain ignorant. But remember, ignorance may be comfort, but it is not protection. They're already here. The question isn't whether you'll find them. The question is whether you will recognize them when you find them, or worse, if you will recognize when you look in the mirror and realize that the person looking back is not completely you. Good luck. You'll need it.